Are you looking for ways to use your 8x8 patterned paper without making scraps? Hi, I'm Jess from JessCrafts.com and I'm here to help you make the most of your crafty supplies and time. So let's get making. Today I have 8x8 paper busting template number 10, which means there are 9 other ones available at JessCrafts.com. The link for this one is right there in the video descriptions for the first link, and you can sign up, and you can sign up individually for all of the previous templates that deal with 8x8 paper and make A2 size cards, no pattern paper scraps. And if you prefer, like you don't want to, get all those emails or something, you can just purchase the pack on Etsy and there's a discount code. But this one's a little unusual. I'm gonna make 8 cards today, which I very rarely do. For 8x8, I try to limit it to like 4, but I thought this design really worked out, and there's plenty of the 8x8 ones that just make like 2 cards. And I like that because then, if I'm trying to use up a pad of paper, I don't need each of my cards or each of my pieces of paper to turn into 8 cards. But I like this design, so I want to share it with you. It's simple, even though it might be a little more time consuming. So it does work with directional pattern paper, and we are working with directional pattern paper today. It's the Paper Boutique Silent Flight Collection, and this is made in the UK. I do like to sometimes use papers made outside the US, even though I'm in the US, just because then it might be a little bit easier for someone else to get their hands on, or it might be something they have in their stash. Okay, but I was able to get mine at scrapbook.com. You know that that is my favorite place to shop. I am an affiliate with them, but they have a really good selection. I like a lot of their exclusives, that kind of thing. So we're gonna just cut our entire piece of 8x8 paper into 1-inch squares, which means that we're gonna have 64 1-inch squares by the end of this process. You might find it helpful to have a way of organizing them. You're going to need 8 squares for each card, and I'm going to start by cutting 1-inch strips. So I'm taking my 8x8 piece of paper and I'm cutting 1 inch off of it and then another inch. Now, this is kind of busy pattern paper, and it has all these little owls printed on it. So my first instinct was like, ooh, is this going to work with 1-inch squares? But I'll show you that what it looks like what a little 1-inch piece looks like of this paper. And as you can see an entire owl in it. It's clear still that it's owl paper, even though I've cut it so small. That's not going to be true for all of your pattern papers. Some of your pattern papers are going to have a larger scale, and so you're going to want to use a patterned paper where the scale works well at this 1 by 1 inch size. And now I don't want you to cut it up and then find out, actually, this doesn't work very well for this design. Instead, what I recommend doing, and I'll demonstrate it in just a moment after I cut all my 1-inch pieces for that row, is I will take a piece of the paper that I'm going to use, and this is what I did before I started chopping this paper, and I'll take another one to compare it for you. Okay, so where'd it go? Here's another sheet of that, and I'll take 2 pieces of opaque paper so that I can really focus on the design. I'm using my grid mat here, but you can come up with another way of measuring 1 inch. So 1 inch by 1 inch, and I think, okay, does that still look like the design I want? So always test a 1-inch square, or anytime you're working with like a really small bit of paper, does it still look good at that small size? And again, the other ones maybe won't always. Like this one, if I cut a 1-inch square from the corner, you can see the owl head, so okay. But I'm like, what if I do the next 1-inch square? For the next 1-inch square, and this is why you might want to test a few. And I know I'm not quite zoomed in for this, but you'll see that once I get to that, it kind of just looks like some feathers, maybe. I think of them as feathers because I know this is an owl paper, and maybe if I combine it with enough other images that show the owl's face, but it's kind of lost what makes it a cool paper by cutting it down to that 1-inch side. So these are just my card bases that I have pre-made and ready to go off to the side that I was using. You use whatever you have, your ruler, etc., to help you. Okay, so we have all these 1-inch squares. I'm gonna keep mine organized. with my scrapbook.com trays. I actually also really love the bigger trays because they fit the A2 size card in them. So if I was trying to organize all my pieces, my A2 card doesn't fit in the small one, but it does fit in the larger one. So I've kind of gravitated to start using the larger ones. And then I'll put all little 8 squares in there so I can keep track of these, because, you know, with 64 little pieces of paper, I'm gonna lose track. I'm gonna cut the rest of these and keep organizing them into the trays, and then we'll keep going with the cards. Next up, I'm going to cut the cardstock mats. Kraft is a color I use a fair amount of, and it's one of the colors you're more likely to be able to get in recycled paper. This is 100% recycled cardstock, so not any new material. I realize I use a lot of paper. I can't always get recycled, and you know, I do my part in other ways, and paper is not the worst resource to be using. But if some people have asked me about that, I've talked about different things I like to do to be more conscious of my, you know, effect on the environment, essentially. And one of those is that it'd be nice to have some recycled cardstock from time to time. So I found this one from the Cardstock Warehouse, and I found it on Amazon. So I'll link to that in case there's anyone who's similarly interested in being able to source recycled cardstock. I have a whole video about like eco-friendly things you can do in your craft room. I have gathered and curated, or I don't know if curated is the right word, but like I've gathered with people of help from other people, and I've continued to add to a list of arts and crafts thrift stores. So if you like to purchase your craft supplies secondhand, or you want to know what to do with your craft supplies when you have basically, like, you know, you're not going to use them anymore, but you'd like to see a little more life, you know, you don't want to just throw them out, then you can donate them to these places. A lot of these places will have like classes for kids, or they'll give the resources to teachers in their community at a discount, or I don't know. So I'm going to link you those things too, just because that is something I like to have some awareness of. Okay. So I cut all of these to 1 1/4 inch strips because I have a bunch of 1 inch squares. I need a bunch of 1 1/4 inch mats. Now, you can always skip mats. If you don't really care about having a mat behind your paper, I think in this case, it's gonna add to the scale of everything, but I'll probably try to show you when we get to it, an example of like, here's what it would be if it didn't have a mat, and here's what it's like with a mat, so you can decide. And you know, it might depend on the particular pattern paper you're working with, but I'm just now also measuring 1 1/4 from my last measurement. So like here's 3 1/2, so I'm gonna go to 2 1/4. I'm just bringing it down 1 1/4 inch each time until I get a piece that is too small to work with. So each of these strips is going to leave me a tiny piece like this. So there are cardstock scraps. And this was a scrap on the end of my whole piece. As you can see, like 2 sheets arrived damaged in that particular pack of cardstock, which is unfortunate. I mentioned a couple more prep things. So as I was cutting this strip, this 1 1/4 by 11 inch strip makes the 8 pieces that I need for each card. So I need 8 1 1/4 by 1 1/4 inch squares. So it's really nice when it works out like that. I will need, since there are 6 strips, when I cut 1 piece of cardstock, I'll need like 1 1/2 pieces of cardstock, and there'll be leftovers. You know, you can always do die cutting and stuff with those leftover scraps, but so I'll keep going with that until I get all of the squares that I need. I am getting everything organized, so once I have my 8 squares of cardstock, I'm putting with my 8 squares of pattern paper, I'm putting my card in there. But then with my sentiments, I used that little scrap of paper that I had left over, scrap of cardstock, and I cut these little 1/2 inch by 2 inch pieces for my sentiment. Of course, you'd adjust that if you were doing different sentiments, but in terms of how I keep things really organized, rather than putting these right into this bucket, I want to make sure I stamp my sentiment first so I don't have to keep pulling my stamp back out. So I'm going to sort of think ahead to my final design. I'm going to use Lawn Fawn Deep Sea ink, so it's a dark blue ink to pull in the blue from the patterned paper, and just so that it's not black. You can absolutely use black. I'm a big believer in, you know, keeping your supplies minimal if that's right for you. Like if you don't have a lot of space, black ink's gonna get you a long way. However, I have committed to just buying 1 set of mini inks. I chose Lawn Fawn because I had some at the time. And so rather than like investing in several different companies, all the latest and greatest ink, I was like, you know, I don't do a ton of colored stamping. I do it mostly for like sentiments and small images and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to pick one set of dye inks, and that's it. I also have distress inks and distress oxide inks because they do techniques. However, I do want to point out you absolutely can stamp sentiments with them. Sometimes they aren't like perfect stampers. They're because the dye ink kind of reacts differently. It's not the most solid image. But if you're going to stamp sentiments, I've never really had a problem with just sentiments. Like a big solid flower stamping with distress ink, maybe. But you don't even have to go with that. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that since we were talking about like, you know, how we get our supplies. We think about having too much stuff, that kind of thing. So there, I have each of my sentiments. Why am I sticking in that tray? I don't know. I just started auto doing that because I was talking about something else. But I'll stick one of these in each tray. And I have like, so I'll just kind of go through my pile of trays. And then that way, when I go to use my sentiment, I'm not pulling that stamp out each time. And in fact, I can put that ink and stamp away if I want to at this point in the process. Let's talk about how we assemble this design. I took my 8 pieces of pattern paper and glued them to their cardstock mats. So I had 8 1x1 squares. I glued them to my 8 1 1/4 by 1 1/4 inch squares. And now I'm ready to assemble. I assembled one kind of like off-screen practice sort of thing, but that doesn't take much practice because this is the design here. So pick how far you want it from the top. I don't give you exact measurements for things like this. Like I just show you kind of a tiny strip. You can sort of adjust those things, but my idea would be that it was like a little more top heavy and left you some room here at the bottom, maybe to add in your sentiment or an embellishment or something like that. So you might be thinking, wouldn't it have been easier to cut then glue like all 64 squares at one time instead of separating them out into the 8 you need for each card? And I think you could absolutely do that. But the reason that I took the 8 at a time from like a single strip of paper is so that I was more likely to have a variety. There are in each strip have few cuts that aren't the prettiest. So like this particular cut here is all like parts of an owl. I mean, there's a little nest, which is nice, but then there's like other ones here where like you have like a pretty good amount of a single owl. And in order to ensure, like this one here, that there was a good mix and I wasn't like getting only these pieces on some cards, or maybe you can see that this owl repeats a lot. So there's 3 of that similar looking, I believe that's a barn owl. So these 3 squares look pretty similar. Well, 3 on one page, you can spread them out, or 3 on one card. But if you somehow wound up with all of that just because of the way you glued them, you know, or try to sort them back out, that's my logic there. You can, if your paper, it doesn't matter as much, then you can go ahead and use all 64 at a time. But I just wanted to kind of explain my choices. Okay, so we're gonna just keep gluing these on. We have a little pattern of a 3, a 2, and then a 3 again. And the 3s go right up against the edge, and then I just kind of eyeball center this one here. And then these 2, because it's never gonna repeat, I just kind of, again, eyeball center it with these 2. I'm not really doing anything specific in terms of measurements. The gap that I'm leaving, I'm kind of just making it pretty similar to the gap that I left at the top. When I go to glue 3 in a row like this, I might want to consider that I'm not putting, so like see this owl repeats in this row, I don't want to glue those next to each other. I'm thinking about little things like that. Again, doesn't matter for all pattern papers, but just pointing some of those things out, some of those things that people find a little challenging about pattern paper, or they use pattern paper and they kind of wonder, why didn't this turn out quite the way I thought it was going to? Little things like that can contribute. I'm using scrapbook.com Artis glue. I also really like Barely Art glue. I like a fine tip for this kind of thing. I do use a tape runner a lot, but for smaller pieces like this, I find it actually more cumbersome. And because it's a relatively small area, I found I could probably put glue on like 2 or 3 of them at a time and then put them down. So if you want to do something like that to save some time, like, you know, glue a couple, then glue, put glue on a few and then stick a few down, you can do that as well. We don't have to do these as fast as humanly possible, but I do like to throw in some little time-saving tips if you're kind of intimidated by like, hey, I'm making 8 cards with one piece of paper. I'm never getting through my pattern paper pad at this rate. Okay, so let's talk about how I'm gonna embellish today because I think there's some interesting tips involved with it. So I wanted to use the Urahoot. We already, or the Mom and Me from Lawn Fawn, but we use this Urahoot. We already put that on a bunch of strips. And I was thinking, oh, well, I want to color one of these. These are a lot more cutesy than the pattern paper. The pattern paper is very realistic. I don't know all the types of owls on here, but again, they mostly look like barn owls to me. Actually, we went to a zoo recently and I saw a barn owl. I love owls. They're one of my favorite animals. I got to see a barn owl and a screech owl, and we saw a great horned owl, but that was at a park. So it was a very owl-filled day. So I felt really lucky that day. But anyway, they're a little cutesy. I don't really want that. But it's the stamp set that I have. So I was like, what if I like kind of tone it down, and I decided to use maybe just this little owl. And he has a sort of similar look in terms of that like point coming down on his face and that flat face. I thought, oh, you know, I think he works. So I was like, let's go back to the scraps. I'm always excited to use up some scraps. So I had these little like 1 by 1 1/4 inch scrap bits, and you can totally do some coloring with this too, but I thought, oh, you know, I could just stamp it with this deep sea ink since it's such a small image, and it would kind of like, that way I'm not worried about like trying to match some of those colors. I'm not trying to, you know, I'm worry about matching some of its realism or anything like that. I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm going to stamp each one of them with deep sea ink, and it's brown, and owls, a lot of them are brown, so it's not gonna, it's, you know, better than like, I wouldn't, you could definitely stamp them on white, especially if you were going like for a snowy owl look, or you probably aren't even using owls, but a lot of animals are brown. So this technique, or this way of doing things, not really technique, you're just stamping, but this way of doing things works out well for a couple different animals. I match the ink, I help kind of coordinate it, pull it in together. I am just gonna fussy cut them. I don't have the coordinating dies. I don't buy coordinating dies very often. I have bought them a little bit more frequently as I pay attention to like how much I think I will use a stamp set / how hard it is to cut them out. This guy's pretty easy to cut out, which is another reason I picked him. I think the larger owl would be too, but I just gave him a quick little fussy cut, and then I can glue him onto the sentiment. I like the idea of gluing him onto the sentiment as opposed to just putting him next to it, because it helps with his scale, for one, because he's kind of tiny, but now he's part of a larger piece. And because when your element interacts with your sentiment, it draws more attention, it makes it more of a focal point. So I thought, you know, I was just gonna use it as like a plain strip, but I thought, well, you know, if I'm gonna make it more of a whole sentiment thing, maybe I'll add a little interest. So I did a quick diagonal cut. You can also do a banner cut, where you kind of like just cut a little triangle in the end. And then I have to decide, do I want to stick it here on top of some of the paper, or do I want to put it on the bottom? I like that when it's on the bottom, it kind of stands out a bit more, becomes a little bit more of a focal point. Here it blends in, but here I also feel like it's like maybe more one cohesive design. So I think I'm gonna glue it on top of the pattern paper, but you let me know. What would you do? Which one did you like better, down here or on top? So if I wasn't going to put mats on them, I would still sort of put them in the same place on the card. I would not put these up against the edge, because then I think there would just feel like maybe too much space in between, but you can, if that looks good to you. But if you want to sort of like, if they feel a little too separated from each other, just kind of scooch everything in a little bit like that. And again, if you have a relatively solid looking pattern paper, which this one kind of is, then it might work without the mats, and that could save you a pretty significant amount of time. And then again, you could put your sentiment across your pattern paper or below it and have a finished card. So with this template and sketch, we now have 8 cards from one piece of 8 by 8 patterned paper and no patterned paper scraps. If you found this video helpful, here's another video where you can find more ideas for enjoying your crafty time and supplies. Let me know you like this video with a share to your crafty community. Subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss the next template tutorial, and check the video description for product links. See you in the next video.